The wind came down from the high, jagged peaks of the Wyoming Territory in the late autumn of 1888, carrying with it the bitter promise of winter and the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine needles. It swept across the sprawling, bruised expanse of the valley, bending the pale prairie grass flat against the hard earth, and it did not stop its rushing journey until it slammed against the weathered, gray boards of the Sloan family ranch house. The structure sat in the shadow of a great sloping ridge near the town of Crestfall, a solitary monument to stubborn human endurance in a landscape that actively resisted being tamed. Inside that house, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, rendering fat and the sharp tang of lye soap a testament to the endless, grinding cycle of preservation and preparation that defined the frontier. At the center of it all, moving with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a pendulum in a grandfather clock, was Clara Sloan. She was 26 years old, an age that in the harsh mathematics of the territory placed her firmly in the category of the permanently unsettled, the sister who had stayed behind while the rest of the world moved forward. The town of Crestfall had long ago made its collective decision about Clara, whispering it over bolts of calico at the general store and over cups of weak coffee after church services. They called her the capable one, the dutiful one, the sister who would never find a husband because she was simply too essential exactly where she was. She was the anchor of the Sloan household, the invisible architecture that kept the roof from caving in on her aging, tired parents and her demanding, boisterous younger siblings. Clara did not think of herself as a tragedy, nor did she spend her evenings weeping into her pillow over the lack of a suitor standing on her front porch. She had long since stopped thinking of herself as unhappy, choosing instead to view herself as a woman with a great deal left to do before the sun went down and the dark claimed the valley. Her days were measured in the heft of cast-iron skillets, the precise tension of a mending stitch drawn through heavy canvas, and the endless, heavy buckets of water hauled from the creek when the pump froze solid in November. The Sloan Ranch ran on a quiet, unspoken understanding that Clara was simply available, a resource as reliable and uncomplaining as the well out back. She was the sister who said yes before anyone even finished asking the question. Her name was a constant chorus in the house, called out from two directions at once. Clara, the coffee is boiling over. Clara, William has torn his good trousers again. Clara, the brindle cow is kicking in the stall and needs soothing. She answered every summons with a nod, setting down whatever task she was currently engaged in to take up the burden of another, and she never let it show on her face if the constant pulling demands bothered her. She had built a fortress of quiet competence around herself, a wall made of chores and duties that kept the loneliness at bay, even if it also kept everything else out. It was into this established, relentless rhythm that Eli Brand arrived in the early days of October. He was a man carved from the same hard, unforgiving landscape that surrounded them, a drifter who had spent the last decade working his way up from the dusty plains of Texas, following the cattle trails and the promise of steady wages. Mr. Sloan had hired him on to repair the miles of dilapidated fencing that marked the boundary of their property, a task that required a man with a strong back and a high tolerance for solitude. Eli was not a man of many words. He spoke when it was necessary, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded attention without ever raising in volume. He possessed a quiet, watchful intelligence, a habit of standing still and observing the mechanics of a place before he ever lifted a hand to change it. From his very first day on the ranch, as he stood by the barn with a coil of wire over his shoulder and a hammer in his hand, he began to notice the shape of things rather than just the work of them. He noticed the way the wind stripped the warmth from the air by mid-afternoon, and he noticed the way the horses favored their left sides when the ground grew hard. But mostly, Eli noticed Clara. He saw the way her name was handed around the property, like a tool left on the nearest surface, picked up and used by anyone who happened to need it, then discarded without a second thought until it was required again. He watched her move across the yard, her skirts pinned up out of the mud, her hands red from the cold water of the wash basin, and he saw the way she went quieter rather than easier, during the rare hour when nobody needed anything from her. It was a profound, heavy quiet, the silence of a woman who had forgotten how to exist when she was not being useful. Eli was a man who understood the value of a solid foundation, having spent his life building fences and breaking horses, and he recognized instantly that Clara was the foundation upon which the entire Sloan family rested. He also recognized, with a slow, dawning clarity that settled in his chest like a warm coal, that a foundation left to bear too much weight for too long would eventually crack. He did not announce his observations. He did not march into the house and demand that her family treat her with more respect, for he knew that such grand, foolish gestures were the province of storybooks, not the hard reality of Wyoming. Instead, Eli began to communicate in the only language he truly trusted, the language of action, of small, deliberate gestures woven into the fabric of their daily lives. The first time it happened, it was a Tuesday morning, the sky the color of bruised iron, threatening snow. Clara had walked out to the woodpile, a large woven basket hooked over her arm, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She was accustomed to wrestling with the heavy axe, splitting the stubborn oak logs herself because her father's back was failing, and her brother William was always conveniently absent when the woodbox ran low. But when she reached the pile, she found a neat, perfectly stacked cord of wood already chopped into manageable stove-sized pieces, resting beside the chopping block. The axe was driven firmly into the stump, its blade gleaming, wiped clean of sap. Clara stopped, staring at the wood as if it might suddenly sprout legs and run away. She looked around the empty, frost-covered yard, seeing only the distant figure of Eli Brand riding out toward the eastern ridge, his hat pulled low against the wind. She did not say a word to him about it when he returned for supper that evening. She merely set a slightly larger portion of stew on his plate, sliding a warm, fresh biscuit next to it without making eye contact. Eli took the plate, his large, calloused fingers brushing the rough wood of the table, and he offered a single, almost imperceptible nod of his head. It was a conversation held entirely without words, a transaction of mutual acknowledgement that echoed louder in Clara's mind than any shouted greeting. The weeks bled into November, and the cold deepened, wrapping the valley in a suffocating embrace of frost and early twilight. The unspoken gestures continued, building a quiet, invisible bridge between the house and the fields. When Clara went to haul water from the creek, she often found the heavy wooden buckets already sitting full on the back porch, the water inside them perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky. When the latch on the heavy barn door, which had stuck and jammed for 3 years, suddenly began to swing open smoothly, Clara knew without asking whose hands had filed down the iron and oiled the hinges. She found herself anticipating these small mercies, looking for the evidence of his presence in the mundane details of her grueling routine. It was a strange, unsettling feeling for a woman who had spent her entire adult life being the provider of care, to suddenly find herself the recipient of it. She felt a vulnerability creeping into her heart, a softening of the rigid armor she wore to survive her own indispensable nature. She began to watch him in return. She noticed the way he held his shoulders, square and unyielding against the wind. She noticed the way a man like Eli Brand commanded respect from the livestock, not through force, but through a calm, unshakable authority. She noticed the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his dark eyes steady and unreadable, yet filled with a weight that made her breath catch in her throat. Their interactions were sparse, defined by the necessity of their proximity. They would find themselves standing next to each other in the dim, dusty light of the barn, measuring out grain for the horses, the air thick with the sweet smell of oats and old hay. The silence between them in those moments was not the awkward, grasping silence of strangers trying to find common ground. It was a solid, comfortable quiet, the kind of silence that exists between two people who understand the value of breath and the uselessness of idle chatter. "The roan is favoring his left foreleg," Eli said one afternoon, his voice breaking a long stretch of quiet as he ran his hands down the horse's trembling limb. Clara stood on the other side of the stall, holding a jar of pungent liniment. "He caught it on a root near the creek yesterday," she replied, her voice low, matching his tone. William was riding him too hard. Eli did not offer a reprimand for her brother, though Clara knew he was thinking it. He simply held out his hand. Clara stepped forward and passed him the jar of liniment. Their fingers did not touch, but the proximity of his large, work-roughened hand to hers sent a sudden, startling jolt of warmth up her arm. He unscrewed the lid and began to work the strong-smelling salve into the horse's leg, his movements methodical and surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "He will need to be rested for 3 days," Eli stated, his eyes focused on his work. "I will tell my father," Clara said. She hesitated, lingering by the stall door longer than she needed to. "Thank you, Mr. Brand, for noticing." Eli stopped his rubbing for a fraction of a second, the rhythm of his hands breaking just enough to reveal that he had heard the dual meaning in her words. He resumed his work, his gaze remaining fixed on the horse. "A man would have to be blind not to notice the things that matter on this place, Miss Sloan." It was the closest he had come to a compliment, a dry understatement that carried more weight than 100 flowery declarations. Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks, and she turned away quickly, burying her hands deep in the pockets of her apron as she walked back out into the biting wind. The town of Crestfall, however, was not entirely blind to the shifting currents on the Sloan ranch, even if they misinterpreted the direction of the flow. It was a small community, bound together by mutual reliance and a shared penchant for gossip, operating much like a Greek chorus that observed, commented, and ultimately judged the actions of its members. Mrs. Gable, the formidable woman who ran the general store with an iron fist and a sharp tongue, was the first to voice what everyone else was thinking. Clara had driven the wagon into town on a crisp Thursday morning to secure supplies for the coming winter, a massive ledger of needs tucked under her arm. She was standing at the counter, negotiating the price of coffee beans and flour, when Mrs. Gable leaned forward, her eyes bright with unasked questions. "I hear your father took on a new hand," the older woman said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A Mr. Brand, is it?" Clara kept her eyes on the ledger, her pencil moving deliberately over the paper. "Yes, ma'am. He is repairing the western fence line." Mrs. Gable hummed, a sound that conveyed a multitude of judgments. "Well, he is a striking man, I will give him that. I saw him in here last week buying tobacco. Quiet, though, like a stone." She paused, wiping a speck of dust from the polished wood of the counter. "I suppose it is a good thing he is out there working. Heaven knows your sister Lily is of an age to start looking for a husband, and a steady man with a wage is nothing to sneeze at, even if he is just a ranch hand." Clara's pencil snapped, the sharp crack of the graphite echoing in the quiet store. She stared at the broken tip, a sudden fierce wave of something dark and protective rising in her chest. The assumption was so natural, so ingrained in the town's perception of her family. Lily was the pretty one, the young one, the one meant for courting. Clara was the fixture, the permanent resident of the kitchen. She carefully set the broken pencil down. "Mr. Brand is here to work, Mrs. Gable. Not to court my sister." Her voice was remarkably steady, betraying none of the sudden jagged emotion that was tearing through her. Mrs. Gable looked taken aback for a moment, then recovered with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Of course, Clara, dear. I only meant, well, a girl has to think of her future." Clara picked up her ledger, her jaw set tight. "We have all the flour we need, Mrs. Gable. Just put it on the account. What country are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. Now, let us get back to the story." The encounter at the store lingered with Clara like a bad taste in the mouth. It crystallized a fear she had not realized she was harboring, the fear that Eli's quiet attentions, his chopped wood and oiled hinges, were not meant for her at all, but were simply the natural actions of a decent man trying to make himself indispensable to a family he wished to marry into. And who would he marry, if not the beautiful, laughing Lily? Clara spent the next few days wrapped in a shroud of renewed, painful silence. She stopped lingering by the barn. She stopped leaving extra biscuits on his plate. She retreated behind her wall of chores, scrubbing the floors with a ferocity that left her knuckles raw and bleeding, trying to scrub away the foolish, fragile hope that had begun to take root in her heart. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she was returning to the natural order of things. But the house felt colder, the chores felt heavier, and the winter stretching out before her seemed endlessly, unbearably dark. Eli, of course, noticed the change immediately. He was a man attuned to the subtle shifts in weather and temperament, and the sudden drop in temperature radiating from Clara Sloan was as obvious to him as a blizzard. He watched her retreat, watched her pull the invisible armor tightly around herself, and he felt a surge of frustration directed entirely at himself. He had thought he was being clear. He had thought his actions were speaking louder than any words he could string together. But he realized, watching her scrub a cast-iron pot until her shoulders shook with exhaustion, that he was dealing with a woman who had been trained by a lifetime of neglect to assume the worst about her own worth. He realized he had been moving too slowly, relying on the quiet understanding of a shared silence when what was required was a loud, undeniable truth. The catalyst for his action arrived not in the form of a dramatic crisis, but in the shape of a community supper held at the neighboring Vance Ranch to celebrate the final harvest before the snows hit in earnest. The Vance family was wealthy by territorial standards, their house boasting real glass windows and a parlor large enough to hold half the town. The entire Sloan family was invited, and as was the custom, Clara was expected to manage the logistics of their attendance. She spent the day pressing her father's suit, arranging her mother's shawl, and curling Lily's hair until the younger girl complained of the heat from the tongs. When they finally arrived at the Vance property, the house was blazing with light and loud with the sounds of fiddles and stomping boots. Clara immediately gravitated toward the kitchen, offering her capable hands to Mrs. Vance, who was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of food required to feed the gathering. It was a safe place. It was where Clara belonged. She tied an apron over her simple, dark blue dress and set to work slicing roast beef and directing the flow of platters out to the dining room. She was a general commanding a bloodless war, her face flushed with the heat of the ovens, her mind blissfully occupied by the immediate demands of the task. Eli arrived late. He had spent the afternoon reinforcing the roof of the Sloan barn, wanting to ensure it would hold the weight of the coming snow before he took an evening for himself. He walked into the Vance house, his tall frame filling the doorway, his dark hair slicked back with water, dressed in a clean, if slightly worn, dark suit. He stood at the edge of the parlor, a quiet observer amidst the swirling chaos of the dance floor. He saw Lily Sloan laughing loudly, surrounded by 3 young cowboys vying for her attention. He saw Mr. Sloan holding court by the fireplace, boasting about the size of his cattle herd. And then he looked toward the back of the house, toward the swinging door of the kitchen, and he saw a flash of dark blue fabric. He did not hesitate. He moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of a man who knew how to navigate dangerous territory, ignoring the polite greetings and the speculative glances of the townspeople. He pushed open the kitchen door and stepped into the stifling heat. Clara was standing at the large wooden island in the center of the room, her back to him, fiercely attacking a massive loaf of bread with a serrated knife. The other women in the kitchen were bustling about, but they seemed to part around Clara like water around a stone. Eli stood just inside the door, his hat held loosely in his hands, watching the rigid line of her spine. He waited. He did not clear his throat or call her name. He simply allowed his presence to fill the space until the weight of his gaze forced her to turn around. Clara stopped cutting. She slowly turned, the heavy knife still in her hand, her eyes wide and startled in the bright light of the kitchen lanterns. She looked at him, taking in the clean suit, the slicked-back hair, the intense, unwavering focus in his dark eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. The noise of the party outside the door seemed to fade away, leaving only the crackle of the cooking fires and the sound of their own breathing. "Miss Sloan," Eli said, his voice low, cutting through the clatter of pots and pans. Clara swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the handle of the knife. "Mr. Brand, are you hungry? The food is already out in the main room." Eli took a slow, deliberate step forward, ignoring the curious stares of the other women in the kitchen. "I am not here for the food, Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips was a physical shock to her system. It did not sound like a tool being called for. It sounded like a destination. He stopped a few feet away from her, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the flour-dusted table. "I came to find you." Clara felt a sudden, frantic fluttering in her chest, a panic born of entirely unfamiliar territory. She looked down at the bread, suddenly acutely aware of her flour-stained apron, her damp forehead, her inescapable role as the servant to the community's joy. "I am busy, Eli. Mrs. Vance needs this bread sliced, and the gravy is nearly ready to be served, and Lily tore the hem of her dress on the wagon wheel, and I must find a needle to mend it before she trips and ruins the evening." She was babbling, throwing up her wall of chores as fast as she could build it, desperate to keep him on the other side. Eli did not retreat. He reached out, his large hand moving smoothly across the table, and he gently but firmly took the knife from her trembling fingers. He set it down on the wooden board with a quiet click. "The bread can wait," he said, his voice carrying the steady, immovable weight of a mountain. "The gravy will not freeze in the next 5 minutes. And your sister is currently dancing with Thomas Vance and seems entirely unbothered by her hem." He looked down at her, his eyes locking onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "You have a remarkable inability to see what is standing right in front of you, Clara." Clara felt the breath leave her lungs. She stared up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I do not know what you mean." Eli sighed, a short, huffing sound that held a trace of self-deprecating humor. "I mean that I have spent the last 2 months fixing every broken hinge on your property, chopping enough wood to burn down the county, and watching you run yourself ragged for people who do not see you." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could smell the clean scent of lye, soap, and leather that clung to his skin. "I mean that I would like to ask you to supper. Tomorrow evening, at the hotel dining room in town." Clara froze. The noise of the kitchen rushed back in for a brief second, then vanished again as she processed his words. She looked at him, her mind struggling to align this reality with the narrative she had lived her entire life. She thought of Mrs. Gable's words. She thought of her sister's bright, unblemished youth. "You mean, with Lily?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question tearing at her own heart even as she forced it out. She asked it as though the invitation must surely have been a mistake, a misdirection meant for someone else, someone who belonged in the parlor and not the kitchen. Eli looked at her, his expression softening, the hard edges of his face giving way to a profound, aching tenderness. He reached out and gently took her flour-dusted hand in his calloused thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I mean with you, Clara," he said plainly, without decoration, without poetry, just the solid, undeniable truth. "I want to sit across a table from you, and I want you to let someone else cook the meal, and I want to talk to you about something other than horse liniment and broken fences." He held her hand firmly, anchoring her to the moment. "I know I am a slow man. I take my time figuring the lay of the land before I build on it. But I have seen all I need to see here." He took a breath, his broad chest expanding. "I am asking to court you, Clara Sloan, if you will have me." The words hung in the hot, crowded kitchen, a plain-spoken declaration that shattered the town's long-held verdict about the spinster sister. Clara stood perfectly still, the warmth of his hand spreading through her entire body, melting the cold, hard certainty of her isolation. She looked at this steady, honorable man, a man who communicated in repaired latches and chopped wood, and she realized that he had seen her all along. He had not just seen the work she did, he had seen the woman doing it. She felt the tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not tears of sorrow, but tears of a profound, overwhelming relief. She squeezed his hand back, her grip surprisingly strong. She drew a shaky breath, letting the wall of chores crumble completely into dust. "I was hoping it would be you," she said, her voice clear and brave, carrying over the noise of the kitchen. "I was hoping you would ask." Eli smiled, a rare, brilliant expression that transformed his rugged face. "It took me long enough to get there," he murmured, his thumb still tracing the line of her knuckles. "Yes," Clara agreed, a sudden wet laugh escaping her lips, a spark of the dry humor they shared flaring to life. "You are exceptionally slow, Mr. Brand." "But I am steady, Miss Sloan," he replied, his eyes shining with quiet joy. "I do not quit a job once I start it." The courtship of Clara Sloan and Eli Brand was a source of endless fascination for the town of Crestfall, a complete upending of the established social order that left the Greek chorus scrambling for new dialogue. Mrs. Gable claimed she had seen it coming all along, a revisionist history that Clara and Eli found endlessly amusing. Their courtship was not marked by grand, sweeping gestures or passionate public displays. It was conducted in the same quiet, deliberate manner that had defined their initial connection. Eli took her to supper at the hotel dining room, pulling out her chair and insisting she order whatever she pleased, watching with quiet satisfaction as she allowed herself to be served. They took long walks on Sunday afternoons, bundled against the winter wind, discussing the practical realities of a shared future, the cost of lumber, the price of cattle, the best way to insulate a roof against the Wyoming cold. They talked about real things, building a foundation of mutual respect and shared labor that was stronger than any fleeting romance. Clara discovered that beneath his quiet exterior, Eli possessed a sharp, observant wit, and they spent hours engaging in dry, understated banter about the eccentricities of her family and the stubbornness of the local livestock. It was a form of intimacy that suited them perfectly, a demonstration of their compatibility and their shared understanding of the hard world they inhabited. When Eli finally spoke to Mr. Sloan to formalize his intentions, the older man was stunned, having assumed, like everyone else, that Eli was either aiming for Lily or perfectly content to remain a bachelor. But he could not deny the steady, undeniable logic of the match, nor could he deny the change in his eldest daughter. Clara no longer moved with the heavy, burdened step of a woman resigned to a life of servitude. She moved with purpose, with a light in her eyes that had not been there since she was a young girl. She still cooked, she still mended, she still managed the household, but she no longer did it as a substitute for her own life. She did it while she planned for a home of her own. They were married in the early spring, just as the snow began to retreat from the lower valleys and the first pale shoots of green broke through the mud. The ceremony was held in the small, whitewashed church in Crestfall, attended by the entire town. Clara wore a dress of simple, sturdy gray wool, adorned only with a collar of delicate white lace she had crocheted herself during the long winter evenings. She did not look like a blushing, fragile bride. She looked like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, standing beside a man who was as solid and reliable as the earth beneath their feet. Their vows were spoken clearly and without hesitation, a public confirmation of the quiet promises they had already made to each other in the shadow of the barn and across the flour-dusted kitchen table. When Eli kissed her, it was a firm, grounding gesture, a seal placed upon a contract they both fully intended to honor until the end of their days. The town celebrated the union with a raucous reception, the loud music and overflowing tables a stark contrast to the quiet nature of the couple at the center of it all. Clara and Eli endured the well wishes and the toasts with patient smiles, their hands clasped tightly together under the edge of the table, communicating volumes in the simple pressure of their fingers. 5 years later, the landscape of the Wyoming territory remained as harsh and unforgiving as ever, but the shape of Clara's world had entirely changed. She sat on the wide, sturdy porch of the ranch house Eli had built for them on a piece of land they had purchased 10 miles north of the Sloan property. The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the valley floor. Clara was mending a tiny, remarkably dirty shirt, her needle flashing in the fading light. She was 31 years old, a mother to 2 young, boisterous sons who possessed their father's dark eyes and their mother's stubborn resilience. The house behind her was quiet, the boys having finally exhausted themselves and fallen asleep in their beds. The air smelled of sweetgrass and the approaching cool of the evening. She heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the wooden steps before she saw him. Eli walked up onto the porch, pulling off his worn leather gloves and tossing them onto a bench. He looked older, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by the sun and the wind, but he moved with the same steady, unhurried grace that had first caught her attention all those years ago. He walked over to her chair and stood leaning against the porch rail, watching her work. "The western fence line is holding," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet evening. "The new posts are deep." Clara did not look up from her stitching, though a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I should hope so, considering you spent 3 days driving them into the rock." Eli chuckled, a warm sound that settled comfortably in the space between them. "A thing built fast is a thing built poorly, Clara." She tied off the thread and bit the end, finally looking up at him. "You have always been a slow man, Eli Brand." He reached out and gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers lingering on her skin. "But I get where I am going eventually." Clara leaned her head against his hand, closing her eyes for a brief moment, letting the solid warmth of him ground her. They sat together as the dark finally claimed the valley, the silence between them as comfortable and necessary as breathing, a testament to a love built not on grand declarations, but on the quiet, enduring foundation of being truly seen. That is the profound, quiet truth about love when it takes root in hard soil. It rarely announces itself with trumpets or poetry. It reveals itself in the chopped wood, the fixed hinges, the willingness to look past the label the world has assigned and see the person standing beneath the weight of it. It is about the courage to stop being useful to everyone else long enough to allow someone to be useful to you. Thank you for riding with me today, and for sharing in the quiet strength of Clara and Eli's story. I am grateful you were here to witness a love built on sturdy ground. Until next time, keep riding.